Welcome into a Tuesday off-season edition of the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. Nick Whalen and Joe Bartel here with you. Going to talk some Scott Fishbowl. Joe, you're already ready to rock. You got some custom projections all made up. You're sending me spreadsheets. I had to open up Excel on my computer. I didn't even know I had Excel. Luckily, we were able to get that. But we will talk, of course, about the unique format, the always unique format, but a new format for Scott Fishbowl 15, who benefits, who doesn't. So we'll give some early reads there with some Scott Fishbowl drafts coming up. Then we'll talk a little bit about some of our favorite prices on wide receivers and running backs, both in best ball and if you're doing any early redrafts. But first, as always, we are brought to you by Circa Resort and Casino out in Las Vegas. The ultimate fantasy football draft can only take place in Las Vegas. Circa Resort and Casino wants to bring your whole league to Vegas with the ultimate fantasy football experience giveaway. The winner brings your 12-person league for a 2-night stay at Circa Resort, and you get to have your draft at a cabana at Stadium Swim. Plus, we're talking limo transportation to and from the airport, a welcome party at the Legacy Club, one of my all-time favorite places, a booth at the world's largest sports book, and a whole lot more. There's no better place to draft than Circa. Got to be 21 and up. Go to circalasvegas.com for more information. All right, Joe. So let's start on the Scott Fishbowl side of things. Like I mentioned, I know you're working on a piece that'll be up at RotoWire at some point. A lot of tech went into this, more than just a normal article. A lot of formatting, things that you and I don't necessarily deal with very often. But that's what happens when you get complicated scoring like we have in the Scott Fishbowl. So, I'm aware of the scoring. I've started to kind of map out my path. But I know you're going to be doing a live Scott Fishbowl draft in Madison, correct? So tell everybody first when that's coming up.
Yeah, June 29th. So we're talking about less than 2 weeks now. Myself and, Jim Coventry will be there as well, too, which I'm excited for. But we're going to have 3 total drafts in Madison, June 29th for it. Jim and I are going to be doing a live podcast recapping our respective Scott Fishbowls at the venue as well, too, which I'm really excited for. And it might be a RotoWire first. I don't know many live podcasts that we have done on these airwaves, which I'm a little bit nervous for, but Jim is ever the professional, especially when he has guests and people watching him. So if nothing else, the Jim experience is going to be something to tune in for that. So looking forward to doing that live podcast in Madison, Wisconsin at the Hilldale Great Dane. So if you guys are around the area for whatever the reason, want to pop in, watch some drafts, there's going to be at least 36 completely nutty people, all super divested into this. And you can draft up to 10 rounds at the venue. The last part of it will be in Sleeper, but more importantly, live drafts for the Scott Fishbowl will be starting at the end of this week. So we'll have a little bit of data, but I think we're talking about maybe 6 live drafts or 6 venues having their live drafts before mine. So not that the RotoWire draft is like the leader of this necessarily, but there's not a lot of data or cumulative ADP on this before we end up drafting June 29th. We're going to have an article posted on the site, like you mentioned, going over some of the Scott Fishbowl settings for you guys who are doing the online drafts like you are, Nick, early July. There will be more ADP out, at least more conversation about it and kind of the strategies people do. But more importantly, I think there's going to be a lot of people at that point, early July, that start to actually look at these scoring settings and be like, wait, what? Because you alluded to it. It has completely befuddled our tech team. And I still think and contend our tech team is one of the smartest in the fantasy industry out there. The projection systems they do, the way they're able to display it. We have some fun things coming up at the end of the month that I'll even add to that more too. This has been an ongoing discussion over the past 48 hours as I'm like, guys, I didn't pass Algebra 2 in high school. Please help me out. I don't understand what to do. They have been awesome at it, but it has still been a struggle. And I think we finally kind of put together the final rankings for this, which will be posted on the site relatively soon.
Yeah, so keep an eye out for that article. I'm sure we'll be doing plenty of promotion ahead of that live event in Madison as well. So if you're in the Madison area, feel free to come check it out. If you're not, make sure you watch that live podcast, full recap of the Scott Fishbowl draft with Joe and Jim. All right, so here's what we're looking at this year, Joe. Obviously, you got super flex as an option if you want to pursue that. I would imagine you likely would. So you got 1 or 2 super flex spots. You got up to 9 wide receivers, running backs, and tight ends. Nothing too crazy there.
Well, I'm going to stop you because I think that actually is the craziest part. This is effectively positionless.
Well, yeah.
For the entire league, it is literally 9 flex and 2 super flex or an additional 2 regular flexes. I don't recall ever playing in a league where there's 11 flexes. This changes everything quite dramatically. And especially if you go under the pretenses of, all right, a normal super flex draft, those first 2 rounds will always be quarterbacks, right? it does not operate that same way. And that was one of the things we sort of uncovered after we were doing a bit of the data side of this.
Yeah, and I will get to why that is the case. You're right. This is not certainly nothing traditional there, but by Scott Fishbowl standards, that's not the wild part.
You're right.
In terms of the scoring, that's where we really start to get deep here. So 6 points for any touchdown, points for a 2-point conversion, 0.04 points per passing yard, 0.1 points per rush or receiving yard, 1 point per first down, and we're looking at tight end premium again this year. 1 extra point per reception for a tight end. Volume, also very key here. 0.5 points per carry. Doesn't matter what happens on that carry. You're just getting a 0.5 point anytime there's a carry. 1 point per target. That's just in the MFL leagues. 1 point per reception. Also in the MFL leagues. In the sleeper leagues, 2.5 points per reception. And like you said, Joe, we're talking quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends. Got some IDP scoring as well that may impact one specific player for the best franchise in the NFL. I won't go through all the IDP numbers, but I know that is a factor for you as you started to go through your rankings. So I guess let's start with the essentially 2 super flex and then everything else is a flex spot format before we get into any of the scoring machinations. You mentioned in a normal super flex league like the one you did in Madison a couple weeks ago.
Yep.
Scrambling for quarterbacks. If you don't get one of the early quarterbacks, you're starting to map out, okay, when do I need to strike? I don't want to end up with one quarterback who might not even be a starter 4 weeks in. So how do you attack a league like this?
And this is going to be all conceptual. Seriously, again, as somebody that's very, very bad at math and has been for most of my life, I stopped doing math when it started involving shapes. I couldn't figure that out. This is really hard for me to grapple. And I think we're caught in the confines of what a traditional fantasy league is, whether it be super flex or 14 team. You're always starting one quarterback. You're always starting at least 2 running backs. You're always starting at least 2 receivers, not 3. You have to have a tight end because there isn't any sort of containment with this. It's really tricky to figure out what you would do. And I think this is maybe just the pea brain in me, but might be easiest to say, I'm going to just draft off of total points. Like more so than ever before, what do the projections say? What is the total point top? And they just keep going down the line because it does not matter what positions you draft. There's maybe some more strategy in seeing how the rest of the board will be able to develop, which is something that you and I have talked about ad nauseum and in past podcasts, or you can identify some guys that you think will go above their projections. I think that's very easy to do, and you can have your takes on. But this thing that I love to do, which is saying, oh yeah, we'll pick 1 through 4. You're going to basically have this based off the ADP and the strategy develop. That's out the window. Like my bread and butter, the whole thing that I've been building the past 2 months, I feel like is completely gone. So to answer your question, it's like, all right, you would theoretically assume you want some of the quarterbacks. We talked about some of the scoring systems. You might have ran over it a bit more, but just to remind people, it's a 0.5 point per carry, 1 point per rushing, 1 point per first down. You have rushing yards as well in the 2. So like the Jaden Daniels, the Lamar Jacksons, Jalen Hurts of the world have additional value relative to Joe Burrow, where like in NFFC, 6 points per passing touchdown. Joe Burrow probably is as valuable to Jalen Hurts in most formats. Not the case from the rushing quarterback perspective.
Right.
But I think what really matters, and this goes back to what the tech guys have talked about and a lot of other smart people who could do their own projections and aren't dumb like me, there is always, no matter what system you use, ESPN, Sleeper, Yahoo, whatever else, there is part of the baked in projections and how these guys are valuing the wins above replacement sort of stat for baseball, that I can get this later on in the draft, and therefore that's how you value or devalue a thing. Because it's such a large pool, even somebody like Patrick Mahomes or Bo Nix or Baker Mayfield, where the 6 points per passing touchdown will matter, that it really is the quarterbacks later on that are also in that same spot. You don't really have to prioritize them. So I think it's like only the top end quarterbacks do I really want to draft early. I guess I'm giving away my strategy here in 2 weeks if you're listening. And I would much rather have the running backs and receivers and tight ends. Tight ends is 3.5 points per reception. By the way, it's 2.5 plus that additional 1 for tight ends. That might become more valuable. And I think specifically at Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, well, you'd think, all right, yeah, those guys are more valuable than Evan Ingram or Tucker Kraft. But you can't think that way. It's more like, is Brock Bowers more valuable than Brandon Ayuk? Which he is. But that's the part which is really, really interesting and something I'm trying to grapple with still.
So the tight end part of this, obviously very interesting. I think the quarterbacks, and I think this will be easier to conceptualize, once your rankings are up on the site. You and I can kind of see the basic version, of where quarterbacks end up being sprinkled in. But, right away, I think when you look at these scoring settings, you think, oh my goodness, what is this going to do to tight end values? Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, perhaps even George Kittle. I think those guys to me are the three that I would still target, but we'll see, kind of depends on your forecast for Sam Laporta, but really more so Bowers and McBride, the way they separated themselves by the end of last season. Are we going to see a draft where Brock Bowers goes 1-1?
I don't know about 1-1 because there is one running back that, by all accounts and other places I've looked at as well too, is universally considered 1-1 if you're recognizing the scoring system for what it is. But I think a lot of people, especially these online drafts, will be just say, hey, well, it's super flex. It's two quarterbacks. I'm going to take Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jay Daniels, whatever first. And nobody's going to bat an eye, but that might not be exactly correct based off the other quarterback positional stuff. Like, there will not be a universal or consensus 1-1. I bet you there was close to 4,000 contestants last year. I don't know how much that means with 12 people per draft, but let's just say it's 600 drafts or something like that. I would be willing to bet that this year there'll be like a very even 25, 15 split on who's first round pick. And I don't know if it's going to, or first overall. And Bowers probably is in that group. I don't think he's number one of that group though. You had mentioned something really interesting. And again, just to reiterate for the 15th time, and we'll do it some more, 9 flexes, 2 super flex or flex. So 11 starting roster spots, but 9 flex. That could mean, and I'll be very interested to see the final data on this, that maybe only 3 or 4 tight ends overall are drafted. That's Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, George Kittle. You had said Sam Laporta. My first thought was TJ Hawkinson, actually, as a guy that gets probably a few more receptions. Your guy, not anymore, but Evan Ingram probably gets a little bit more valuable. Your former guy. Yeah. With the, like, there really is no reason to draft a Tucker Kraft or Kyle Pitts over Wan'Dale Robinson, who we conventionally talk about as one of the last picks in our best ball drafts. Like, that's what we're at right now in this landscape, even with the 3.5 points per reception. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's probably only 5, 6, 7 tight ends total that are drafted in this format.
Really? Just total in the entire draft?
I mean, like, again, it's 12 team, 18
there's 11
roster spots. Right. But they're not, we know fantasy wise that the tight ends are kind of capped to a certain degree. Like, if we're saying I just need volume, like that's where this ends up going, 3.5 points per reception. But how many tight ends in the NFL are getting the necessary volume? And would you rather have, let's just say, Travis Kelce or Trey Benson, that if James Conner goes down, you're going to have Trey Benson be significantly more valuable? Like, that's where I go back to this. And I maybe not 7. I should probably go over the number exactly more, but there will be less tight ends drafted, I think, more than you would expect because of this positionless football.
So one note on the quarterbacks. So I'm looking at your preliminary rankings. Jalen Hurts comes in behind Jayden Daniels, but ahead of Josh Allen. Comes in just behind Lamar Jackson. Like, the first downs thing is what stands out to me with Jalen Hurts, because so many of his carries are in those, 3rd and inches, 4th and inches. I think a little over a third of his carries last year went for a first down. When you're putting this together, like, how much do you factor that in? Is that something we actually need to consider? Because outside of Jalen Hurts, his very specific role for that offense, I feel like, the first downs thing can be very, very difficult to predict or carry over year. So how much does that specific scoring tweak factor into your rankings?
Lamar Jackson was one of the top quarterbacks for rushing first downs as well, too. And that one's pretty, rushing 4 first downs. Josh Allen, I think, ended up being, I was looking at either 4 or 5 over the past 3 years. So he's kind of universally in that same spot. It really is more so that after Jayden Daniels, and this kind of reflects in the rankings themselves, the quarterbacks that rush for first downs and also just rush in general drop off dramatically. I mean, it's just like an absolute chasm afterwards with those. And you could maybe throw in a Justin Fields. I think that's going to be a really interesting value point for a lot of folks, because he theoretically starts all year for the Jets. He probably will run for a lot of first downs. It doesn't really, turnovers don't really matter in this format right now, which is why I think Josh Allen would more conventionally get punished. He's not. And I think that's where he ends up being a little bit closer to it. But after that, you look at the Bo Nixes of the world, Patrick Mahomes, Baker Mayfield, that whole quarterback range that we're like, I don't really want to go. Like, it really doesn't make sense. The problem ends up being, I like Trevor Lawrence, or like JJ McCarthy is probably not a great example, but that quarterback group, even with Jordan Love, they're not running really either. So it becomes a massive difference of those first 4 or 5 guys, maybe Justin Fields included, and everything else sort of evens out with the way the scoring system is set.
All right, so we got Jamie in the chat chiming in. He said he's been doing some Scott Fishbowl 15 mocks. He said he took 7 tight ends in the first 10 rounds. His other players, Derrick Henry, Bo Nix, and Dak Prescott. His tight ends were Bowers, Kittle, Hawkinson, Kelsey, Andrews, Njoku, Ferguson, and Hunter Henry. So this flies in the face of our idea that only a handful of tight ends would be drafted.
Well, I mean, there's a reason why 7 are available in his first 10 rounds because nobody else is thinking about it. So if you have a Jamie in your league, that's fine. But I'm more willing to bet that people are going to get caught in conventional fantasy brain and think, I don't need to have this many tight ends. They're not thinking about the positional flexibility might be. And there's a few of these tight ends that I just like for this example, like I don't think David Njoku is going to get all that much volume. Jake Ferguson, I like a lot. Hunter Henry is more of a touchdown merchant than anything else. Like there's a few of those that I pick at, but I actually would go back to like, that confirms my theory that somebody was able to accumulate 7 in their first 10 rounds is a reflection of the league not overall understanding how valuable these tight ends could be.
All right, so how does this break down? When you ran the numbers in terms of projections for this scoring system, running backs versus wide receivers, who gets pushed up, who gets pushed down? Is there a certain type of player that we should be targeting?
Yeah, and again, 3.5 points per reception for tight ends, but receivers still get 2.5 points per reception. The problem ends up being running backs can catch passes too. They also get a 0.5 point per carry. They also have the opportunity for more first downs as well too. And this is off of sleeper scoring. I couldn't figure out how to do the MFL, which is a point per reception and a point per target.
Right.
That's a different thing altogether. It did prioritize the top end running backs. And I thought that was really interesting because the idea is, well, we're going to draft Bijan and Saquon and Derrick Henry and Jahmyr Gibbs early in the first round of our traditional redraft leagues because what's going to be available in round 6 or 7 isn't as valuable. But it's really just prioritizing, again, if we're just thinking of the idea of who's going to score the most points in this system, because that's all that matters, the running backs traditionally are going to do it. So even go like Bucky Irving, that's a late first round pick based on the projections. Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs, Ashton Genty. It was a lot of the top end running backs. And I wonder if other people are either going to draft tight end early or draft a few of the quarterbacks, because this is supposed to be a super flex league in your mind, that you could actually fade running back, even though it's the total point. This is me as the Joe Bartel talking draft strategy. You could actually get more of these running backs to fall a little bit because people are going to assume I want tight end premium. I want quarterback premium, and I'll get these running backs later. Like I don't know. What do you think about that? Looking at the numbers that I sent you and kind of the projection totals with the running backs being as high as they are.
I think it makes sense. I think it makes sense overall. You know, it's like the players that you would expect to be at the top are at the top because they have the combination of carry volume, because you're getting that 0.5 point per carry, and pass catching volume, right? There's a reason Bijan Robinson, comes in at number 1 by a reasonable margin. We're talking, like 10 overall points, but that's over Saquon Barkley, which is saying a lot. Jahmyr Gibbs, is inside that top 5. Derrick Henry comes in behind Bucky Irving. I think that's interesting. When you look at volume versus pass catching ability. Beyond that, there's nothing too surprising. I guess I'm surprised that Achane and McCaffrey don't rate a little bit higher.
The Achane one, I'm not surprised with, because I think there has to be a factoring of first down runs. And that's not really what Achane is built to do, right? You think about the Dolphins offense, like he'll get first down runs. I'm saying he can't. Christian McCaffrey, I'm a little bit surprised with, because he will be such a factor from a pass catching perspective, the 2.5 points per reception part of it. But I'm not surprised that Achane falls a little bit further when he's sacrificing, let's just say 60 less carries to Derrick Henry, or more of your traditional, like Jonathan Taylor's of the world, for example. Like I'm not surprised on Achane. McCaffrey is, but the way we do our projections, and it's different than a lot of people out there, we are literally projecting in some sort of injury. And for the players like McCaffrey, who are a bit more injury prone, it is weighted just a bit more. And I think that might be a little bit of the reason for it.
Yeah, I mean, we're ultimately, for Achane, we're talking about a difference of, 15 first down runs between he and guys like Tony Pollard, Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara, Bucky Irving.
That he has 15 more than them?
He had 15 fewer first down runs. So you're right about Achane. But where you really see the big difference is those guys at the top, right? Like the truly elite running backs. Derrick Henry, 94 first down carries. Kyron Williams, 85. Saquon, 82. Bijan, 82. Jacobs, 73. So it all matters, right? I mean, that's a difference of 50 plus points if those numbers hold up year over year in this system.
Yeah, and again, we're looking literally at the total points end of the year. That's sort of your goal. I think one of the values, and again, I'm tipping my hand in here in 2 weeks, I think Kyron Williams is being undervalued in this sort of format, given there really is nobody behind him. I mean, like Blake Corum and Jarquez Hunter, I like both players. Doesn't seem like Sean McVay likes either player, that he didn't use Blake Corum at all last year, then drafted Jarquez Hunter earlier on this year. I think Kyron Williams, especially if he is due for the extension or trying to do it, has the touchdown upside, runs for first rounds. There isn't a Jalen Hurts quarterback sneak that's taking them away, and is involved from a rushing perspective, that there is just a floor that he gives you. Like, I think actually, if you think the Rams offense is one of the best in the league, like I do, Kyron Williams needs to be closer to that Bucky Irving, Devon Achane range, which is like late first round spot.
All right, let's talk wide receivers. So to me, when I look at this initial run of projections, you don't necessarily see guys in dramatically different order than you would in a quote unquote normal draft. Still, Jamar Chase comes in at wide receiver 1, then Jefferson, then Lamb, then St. Brown, then Neighbors, then Thomas, then Nakua. Then we're into Drake London and Nico Collins. So pretty similar to what you would see in your traditional PPR league draft. Where do we start to get some differentiation? As we get deeper into the player pool, are there specific types of wide receivers who become overvalued or undervalued?
Well, like Marvin Harrison in particular, I thought was interesting. He's more in the Cortland Sutton range. If we're to convert this to best ball conversation, Marvin Harrison's going about a round later in the Scott Fishbowl settings, at least off the projections that we ran, than what you'd see in the half-point PPR for underdog. And it's crazy because half-point PPR, why is Marvin Harrison going too high? Well, Nick, we've talked about this before. He shouldn't be drafted where he has been in underdog, but I think this is actually more categorically correct. Marvin Harrison isn't this possession guy. That's Trey McBride, who in this offense is going to be like a top 6-7 pick with this sort of scoring system too. And there's Kyler Murray that's also eating into some of the yardage production, able to run a little bit more for that too. Like, that's a drop off. And I think that tier and Devonta Adams sort of fits that same sort of mold. I think you could apply it to George Pickens as well for that Cowboys offense. You were already drafting George Pickens more in that 5th or 6th round range, but he is more easily in that spot, I think, for the Scott Fishbowl. It's that, I don't know, what would you call that? Like a 3rd or 4th tier of receivers that would maybe in weird builds be your wide receiver 2, but more conventionally wide receiver 3. That's the one that I see a pretty big drop off. And it's where the value of the running backs, if people are not viewing it correctly, you could probably gobble up a few more of the running backs and avoid having to play George Pickens as your flex 5 or 6, which is really what you're trying to, I think that's the best case scenario to kind of avoid.
Okay, we'll do one more thing on Scott Fishbowl, and then we'll move on to some other players that we want to hit here. What about the mid to lower end quarterbacks? We're talking about this being a super flex league. You have the ability to start 2 quarterbacks if you choose. And according to our projections, Daniels, Lamar, Hurts, Josh Allen, they're still, borderline first round values. What happens as we get deeper on in quarterbacks, especially when you start getting into the Jordan Loves of the world, the Bryce Youngs, the Michael Penixes?
There ends up being an evening out of that. I would say quarterback, let's just say 15 to 20 range. Again, we've talked about this a lot in different podcasts. You and I can mention the ones that we have favorites of, but conventionally it's Jordan Love, Tua. You can throw into that mix Matthew Stafford, Michael Penix, JJ McCarthy, Jared Goff to a lesser extent as well too. That group of quarterbacks ends up being equal to, at least from a projection standpoint, like that Rashee Rice range. That's probably not good. Rashee Rice is further down the list. Like Roma Dunze, Caleb Johnson, I think Khalil Shakir, Jameson Williams. So we're talking about maybe a difference of like 4th or 5th round ADP. And that makes sense. But the problem ends up being, if everyone views these quarterbacks, because it's supposed to be traditional super flex, or at least that's what your idea would be, well, I have to have my first 2 in the 2 rounds. Well, it's a 12-team league. That's 24 quarterbacks. Even though the projections would say don't draft Caleb Williams in round 2, you should be drafting another other position. You might be boxed out. You might be forced to if your league is viewing it one way or another. And if it's like the super flex league that we talked about 2 weeks ago on the podcast, where 3 sets of 3 people did different strategies, you might be able to wait on quarterback a little bit more. Yeah. But if it's Caleb Williams or Khalil Shakir, it might be Khalil Shakir that take over it because of what the volume I think he gets in as a first-down weapon in a really good offense. Like, that's sort of what we're kind of have to consider.
So you mentioned Rashee Rice briefly. He's somebody that stood out to me as coming in significantly lower in our initial set of Scott Fishbowl projections than you would see in the usual ADP. Is that just as simple as we're not projecting him to play 17 games?
I think that's exactly it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's exactly. Without knowing the numbers for certain, that would be my guess. Yes.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. We will hit some players that we've been targeting lately in our best ball drafts, guys that we are starting to hone in on. Put up a video over on the YouTube channel, Joe. So I got some receiver names to throw your way. I know you have some guys that you want to talk about as well. But first, we're brought to you in part by the NFFC. The NFFC RotoWire Fantasy Football Online Championship is officially live. Play fantasy football against your favorite RotoWire experts on the NFFC this season. Jeff Erickson, Nick Whalen, that's me, and more will compete in the RotoWire NFFC Online Championship for a shot at $250,000. Sign up for a draft today over at rotowire.com/high stakes. That's rotowire.com/high stakes. Love the NFFC. Love the NFFC, Joe. That is, we play in so many fun leagues every year, but that one always rises to the top.
It's a top 3 league for me every time. And I actually like the auction format too. Like if you were in an auction league with friends and family and you want sort of a prepper, there isn't any best ball version of auction leagues. I don't think I feel like the ESPN mock drafts do a good job. Like if you want to put down a little bit of money and get some good reps, good practice against good competition, the NFFC, I've liked the auction form. I did a live draft for that last year. It was a blast. I really want to do it again as well too. So I would absolutely recommend the NFFC auction draft systems too.
I think the last time I did an auction, Joe, was like 3 or 4, probably even more. This was like, I don't know, 2018. I do a lot of auctions for NBA, not so many for NFL. And I infamously bought Leonard Fournette for like $58. And I think that soured me on auctions.
And then you paid
I just had to take a couple
That's
years
exactly
off after that. Yeah, that was like one of the worst buys in RotoWire history. Anyway, we both got a few players that we want to go kind of rapid fire through here. And, one guy that you and I were chatting about on SiriusXM earlier today, we're in agreement. We're both targeting this guy. We have hope that year 2 will be better than year 1. Keon Coleman in Buffalo.
Yeah, I know that Keon Coleman had some comments earlier this weekend or whatever, saying it was a horrible rookie season, some other explicitives as well too. It wasn't good. Like I get that. Where the Bills drafted him, I think really matters. I'm not really like a draft pedigree. You got to follow that all the way. But when you look at this Bills offense and the guys that they signed, they had Elijah Moore just a little bit earlier in this offseason, but more consequentially Josh Palmer, that 3-year, $36 million deal. All that tier 3, tier 4 receivers got the 1-year, $12 million treatment. Tutu Atwell's the same way. That was all, I think, to be in position to win playoff games and not dependent on a receiver, like a Devontae Adams, Aaron Rodgers thing with the Packers a couple years ago. But Keon Coleman, I think for the Bills to get to the level they want to be, a Super Bowl champion, has to be the guy that develops. It's not going to be Josh Palmer. I don't think Elijah Moore gets there. If it's Khalil Shakir and Keon Coleman as your wide receiver 1A, 1B combo, if Keon Coleman can elevate to the draft capital that was invested in him, this Bills offense will be dramatically better. It's why they traded for Amari Cooper last year. Cooper ended up being injured, also not very good at the tail end of his career. It's why he's not signed to anybody else right now. But like the Bills wanted to get an alpha receiver, didn't have it materialize this way. And I think year 2, Keon Coleman, I liked him coming out of college. I have a lot of dynasty shares still of him. I think Keon Coleman can be a really good receiver. And I'm hoping that it will just be more involving Keon Coleman in the offense. He got injured too midway through the season. I think that made a difference as well, which he included in his comments earlier this week.
Yeah, I think the injury did derail him maybe more than we realized. Not that he was putting up, crazy numbers before that, but missed 3 or 4 games kind of in the middle of the season. And after that, caught 10 of his final 29 targets down the stretch and into the playoffs. Just really wasn't a factor. Like the snaps were there for the most part, just really wasn't all that involved in the offense. And look, I'm with you on the draft capital thing. It's not automatic just because you invest the 33rd pick in someone, that guy doesn't automatically turn into the player that you hope he would. But there is an organizational obligation to see that through, right? As opposed to a 4th or 5th rounder, where it's a lot easier to just kind of accept that, all right, maybe this isn't the guy that we thought he would. Like they're going to give Keon Coleman every opportunity to at least turn into that player. Khalil Shakir, really nice player, not really a number 1. He's probably better suited as a higher end number 2, or even kind of that bit type of guy. They're rolling the dice on Josh Palmer. We'll see. Thought he was in some pretty decent situations with the Chargers, never really capitalized. Curtis Samuel's still hanging around, but we'll see on Elijah Moore. Those just kind of feel like flyers more than anything. But there's opportunity here for what was the 2nd highest scoring team in the NFL last season. You're playing with Josh Allen. Yes, Buffalo had plenty of success spreading the ball around to a million different receivers. I don't think anybody had more than 4 or 5 touchdowns, at least receptions last year for the Bills. That can work, But you want to have what you feel like is a go-to guy. I think they're going to give Keon Coleman every opportunity to be that. Will it happen? I don't know. But am I willing to take that chance with the 135th pick in my draft? I think I am.
Yeah, 8th or 9th round ADP. I had mentioned on SiriusXM, I like Rashod Bateman as well. Bateman and Keon Coleman are basically the two receivers drafted one another. There's like 8 running backs in between Tyrone Tracy, Najee Harris, Ramondre Stevenson. Like there's a lot of those running backs and then those 2 receivers. And I often just end up grabbing both receivers. Like if I can get a build with both Keon Coleman and Rashod Bateman as my wide receiver 5 and 6, I like that situation a lot because I think one of them, at least from a best ball perspective, is going to give me 2 or 3 scoring weeks, which you're looking for from that position at that time.
Yeah. And, I think you're talking best ball ADP. I'm looking at Keon Coleman's NFFC ADP in the last month, quite a bit later. I mean, we're talking round 10, even round 11 in some drafts, about pick 130 on average. And that's a sample of, 44 drafts that have gone off in the last month. We don't have to go deep on Rashod Bateman, Joe, but here's another guy that I had on my list. Wide receiver 58 right now at the NFFC. Just signed an extension with the Ravens. I do think it's fair to look at last year as somewhat of a best case scenario. 9 touchdowns on 45 catches. That's going to be really, really difficult to repeat. He had a couple splash games where he was only targeted like 3 or 4 times and ended up with, big yardage totals and a couple touchdowns. So I understand that that's probably not replicable, but he's still only 25. The Ravens offense, like the Bills, still one of the best in the NFL. I think he's going to be in a great situation. The other thing that does worry me a little bit though, is we saw a huge jump in passing touchdowns for Lamar last year, 41. Yeah. That I do wonder. It's like, could that almost flip-flop with Josh Allen, right? Where it's like, I think Josh Allen throws more touchdowns next year. I don't know that we can count on Lamar going back-to-back 40-plus touchdown seasons, but either way, for a guy who's going around pick 150 right now, I think still a pretty decent value. You're getting the number 2 receiver in a really good offense. And DeAndre Hopkins is just a non-factor to me.
Correct.
He's a name. I would love to see him get a Super Bowl to cap off his career. It doesn't really worry me in terms of workload for Bateman.
That's the exact thing that I wanted to highlight. Whether it be Keon Coleman, who we think is one of the best offenses of the Bills, or Lamar Jackson and Rashod Bateman, with the Ravens being one of the best offenses in the league. Jamie in the chat had asked, what do you think about Cedric Tillman in the same range as Rashod Bateman and Keon Coleman? I like Cedric Tillman. I actually wrote about him a couple his rookie year. I ended up doing like one of the draft analysis on him. I wasn't all that surprised as to what happened last year. Yes, there's the concussion stuff, just like Chris Olave, where people are discounting Chris Olave and whether he'll be healthy. Cedric Tillman could be like a concussion or 2 away from being in that spot too. Like that was a lot of games missed. The Browns offense will be significantly worse than what the Bills and Ravens could be. And even if there is a bit of a volume bump, a volume floor riser for Cedric Tillman with just Jerry Jeudy, David Njoku there, I guess Deontay Johnson, if you think he sticks around, that's not enough. Like I'd rather have pieces of a really good offense as opposed to getting the secondary or third piece on a bad offense.
All right. We've already talked to Jacoby Myers. I don't want to have to do that whole soliloquy again.
He looks great in the Scott Fishbowl format. I'll just say that.
Sure does. He looks great in any format because he's a great receiver. And once again, we are dramatically undervaluing a guy who was a top 20 receiver last year. But no, we'll save that that'll be its own like separate 7-part podcast series. I'll do like a narrative podcast on Jacoby Myers. You and I think are in somewhat agreement on Chris Godwin. Maybe not quite as aligned as we are on the previous 2 players we just talked about, but I'm in on Chris Godwin right now, wide receiver 31 at the NFFC. And, part of it is, yes, he was on track. At the time he was injured, he was a wide receiver 2. And that was 7 weeks into the year, right? We're not just talking about like, oh, he had, 2 big games in the first 3. Like this was fairly consistent at 2 huge games to begin the year, was just coming off of like a 36 fantasy point game in week 6. The injury is a little daunting. But as I told you on XM this morning, again, I'm not a doctor. I'm less concerned about a bone injury than I am anything to do with a tendon, a torn ACL, a torn Achilles, things like that. I think Chris Godwin will bounce back. I don't think the Bucs would have given him an extension if they had concerns about that. I think the 2 factors, if you want to push back on this, are 1, no Liam Cohen. He's in Jacksonville. 2, you add Emeka Egbuka to what was already a really good wide receiver room.
So for the listening audience, because I'm aware of this, but I want to make sure they are, who's being drafted in that sort of range for Chris Godwin? Because I think that's key to this question.
Okay, so this is at the NFFC. Receivers in that range, guys who go roughly 10 to like 5 picks ahead of him. Jamison Williams, Tet McMillan, Jerry Jeudy, guys who go shortly after George Pickens, Jalen Waddle, Roma Dunze, Calvin Ridley, Jordan Addison.
I like Jalen Waddle more than everyone in that group, and that maybe is another 7-part different podcast series that we could go over that more. But when we're talking about the guys before him, a rookie on a bad offense.
Yeah, I don't want that.
Jameson Williams, who we've talked about before, as well as concerns, especially if I'm thinking like more on the Scott Fishbowl side where there's less volume. Absolutely, I'm taking Chris Godwin over that group. Like I think that's just categorically incorrect. Chris Godwin should probably be 4 or 5 different players ahead, but it's not like a massive difference. That's where I was going to this too. I think Chris Olave is getting drafted after Godwin. I think we talked about around that range.
Yeah, he is. He's
I like
going about
Olave,
8 picks after on average.
I like Olave more than Chris Godwin as well too. So that's fine as well. I felt like last year I mostly positively influenced your picks and your thought process in a few of your leagues.
Yeah.
I know I converged to the dark side on Josh Jacobs that ended up working out. I think you're going to do the same for me and Chris Godwin because that was not a guy I had really thought about too much. But you're right. Like at that current ADP, let's just assume that he doesn't come back 100%. Like, again, we're not doctors, but I think it's fine if we say he doesn't come back 100%. Godwin was still really, really good for that offense. We know Baker Mayfield likes him. Like we'd say what you want about the coordinator change. Like as long as your quarterback knows that he likes that receiver, that matters to me. And I'm not that convinced Emeka Egbuka does anything year one. I think Emeka Egbuka is a safety net for both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. And the Buccaneers have playoff aspirations. That guy will help them get to the playoffs and succeed if one of those guys gets injured. It does not mean that Chris Godwin will maybe get the peaks that he was. I think that might be the Liam Cohen part of things. But you're not drafting him at that AP behind those players because you think Chris Godwin will be wide receiver 2 at the end of the year. You think he's going to be really solid wide receiver 2 for your team, and that's the important part.
Well, I hate to say it. I also don't know if I trust Mike Evans to stay healthy. He turns 32 in 2 months, and I know nobody has been more consistent than Mike Evans. I would rather take Chris Godwin 30 picks after Mike Evans than take Mike Evans at the end of the 3rd round.
I think I'd rather have Mike Evans. I think
32.
How old are you, Nick?
Undisclosed.
Okay. All right. Well, Mike Evans, I think, has seen it across other quarterbacks, other offensive schemes, has always been the guy that gets 70 catches and gets 10 plus touchdowns. And he certainly was that for a much better offense with a much better quarterback than he's had for most of his career. I recognize there will be a fall off at some point, but it doesn't always have to be so dramatic that we've seen at the running back position in particular. And I think the way that Mike Evans typically plays, the jump ball thing on the boundaries, you're not really getting lit up all that much. Like the injury that was fluky last year, that probably is a sign that, hey, this is an older receiver, but I'm not convinced this is Mike Evans that's turned to DeAndre Hopkins for the Titans or something like that.
It didn't look that way last year. I'll give you that. I just say the cliff comes soon for these guys. It comes quickly, right? And I don't want to be caught on the wrong side of that, I guess is the way I would look at it. All right, let's hit a couple more names here and then we'll be on the way out, Joe. So Kaleb Johnson, I know that's somebody you've been grabbing a lot of, especially in best ball.
It's just wrong, categorically wrong ADP. I don't know what it is for the NFFC. Maybe you can look that up for me real quick. But
I can. Well, where's he going in best ball?
He's in the 6th to 7th round turn. So it's normally right after RJ Harvey. It'll be right there with Quinshon Judkins. Aaron Jones gets to be in that same spot. We've talked about this a million times before, but right now I've seen James Conner, Dave Montgomery elevate above that, which is what we typically see around this point and moving certainly into July. It's now the redraft guys that are getting involved, getting their practice, getting their reps, and that ADP just will get pushed up, which is what should happen in a half-point PPR league. I don't know why Underdog operates the way it does, but I think once people realize Kaleb Johnson is at minimum just going to be Najee Harris, who was getting drafted around 8 last year, and I think return value on that, his ADP will go up. I think Kaleb Johnson can also be a better version of Najee Harris as a pass catcher, as a goal line runner, and Aaron Rodgers, whether people like it or not, is going to make that offense just a little bit better than it was last season too. I think Kaleb Johnson's ADP is just wrong categorically right now, certainly in best ball. I think NFFC too.
The NFFC is going picked 72 on average. So about that same range, right at the, literally right at the 6-7 turn. Could not be more dialed in on that. So yeah, we'll see how that, continues to progress. I'm with you. I think that's going to be rising as we get closer to the season.
Are you getting any Kaleb Johnson? Like, is that one of those, if you could have a running back 3, you're very comfortable taking Kaleb Johnson?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely comfortable taking him. I mean, guys going in that same range, I would take him over Aaron Jones. I continue to take a lot of David Montgomery. You're not going to talk me out of it. I'm going back to the well on David Montgomery. I actually have some interest in Tony Pollard. That's a little bit eye of the beholder as far as how you think that Tennessee offense is going to go. We've talked about our reluctance to buy in with DeAndre Swift. It's like until the Bears bring somebody else in, I'm going to have some DeAndre Swift shares. I'm not going to feel good about it, but it's something I'm going to do. And Isaiah Pacheco is still going almost a full round after Caleb Johnson in the NFFC. And the ADP I'm looking at is for the last month. So I can isolate that and take a look at perhaps how that's changed. But that's kind of the last guy for me, because after Pacheco, you're getting into Tyrone Tracy. I don't want anything to do with that situation. Tracy and Scadaboo, then it's Brian Robinson, Najee Harris, Charbonnet, Javonte Williams. Obviously, my guy Travis Etienne, tends to be available later, although his ADP continues to rise as well. But of that group, no, I'm totally fine with Caleb Johnson. I'm totally fine with Pacheco.
I'm going to flag plant here, and I know you're sweating right now. You have no air conditioning going on. I want Caleb Johnson to be the final talking point for this podcast. We can extend it further if we need to. What is the difference in your mind? Because you're a guy that's saying David Montgomery all the way. Joe's not talking me out. That's fine. What's the difference between David Montgomery and Najee Harris, who ran for 1,000 yards 3 straight years, 1,200 yards his rookie year, other than the touchdowns? And you and I both have acknowledged, okay, but other than the touchdowns that you and I have both acknowledged might not be there in a post-Ben Johnson world, I don't get where you're like, oh yeah, David Montgomery for sure. The Lions offense will absolutely be better. They'll definitely have David Montgomery get 10 plus touchdowns again. Like, why are you so certain of that when I'm saying it's more likely that Caleb Johnson is going to score more than Najee Harris's 5 average touchdowns over the past 2 years?
I'm more concerned about the Lions passing game than anything else.
Okay.
My concern lies with like Jameson Williams more than anybody. I know Laporta kind of bottomed out last year, and it feels like it's going to be hard for him to do worse than that. And even if the Lions do regress, like I don't think we're talking about just a massive drop off. Like they scored like 200 more points last year than the Steelers, right? Like even if you subtract 100 points from last season,
yeah,
that's a lot of touchdowns off the board. They're still a significantly better offense. Maybe you think with Aaron Rodgers, the Steelers make some progression there. I guess how much does the Rodgers signing impact how you view Caleb Johnson, if at all?
Yeah, I think it makes a difference that the Steelers offense as a whole will be better. Now,
yeah,
a 200-point difference. I couldn't get past algebra 2. Let's just say Ben Johnson and his wizardry accounts for like 60 more points than the average coordinator.
Sure.
And let's just say the Steelers offense, with whatever they're doing at quarterback and Arthur Smith being stupid, will account now for a difference of 70 points with Aaron Rodgers being the quarterback instead. And I think a better offense involved. That's still a pretty wide chasm, but if we're spreading out those touchdowns from other positions, there's some fluky nature that we know of touchdowns overall. Like David Montgomery as a 1,100-yard runner with 8 touchdowns, and Caleb Johnson as a 1,000-yard runner and 7 touchdowns. Like I just think I would sooner bet on the younger player.
Yeah.
And I'm a little bit worried. I think cautious is the right word. Like I was never all in on Jared Goff. I've been proven wrong now the past couple of years, but the NFL also doesn't think Jared Goff is all that great of a quarterback. If Ben Johnson was propping up this offense, and specifically Jared Goff, it will have a whole trickle-down effect. It's not just the passing game.
Do you have any concerns about Jaylen Warren? We haven't even touched on that part of it.
I just assume Jaylen Warren is going to do exactly the same thing. He's the one variable this has not changed.
Yeah.
Because Arthur Smith is there. The quarterback situation has changed, but we saw Arthur Smith use Jaylen Warren X way. They then drafted a running back relatively early. That was the Steelers' second pick. Yeah. So they traded away DK Metcalf. It's possible that the Steelers could have taken Caleb Johnson in the second round if they wanted to, and then used Caleb Johnson exactly in the Najee Harris replacement. Nothing else has changed. I think Jaylen Warren is probably going to operate basically the same way.
All right, we'll end on this, Joe. We don't need to go through any more players, but we do have an interesting dynasty trade question in the chat from Michael. He said, all right, he took over an orphan team that needed depth. So he traded away Jonathan Taylor, Josh Downs, DJ Moore, and next year's second to get Devontae Adams, Jaden Reed, Chuba Hubbard, and Tony Pollard. PPR dynasty, starting 3 receivers.
Yeah, 4 for 3, right? If we're talking about depth, that matters a lot. I like Jonathan Taylor a lot, and I think he's the youngest asset, more or less, out of these guys. I would not want to give up Jonathan Taylor and not get something of consequence back. I would sooner assume I like the Jonathan Taylor and DJ Moore side of things. Devonta Adams, what conservatively has 2 more years max that he's going to be a fantasy relevant guy. We don't even know if Jayden Reed will be. And I think a lot of people think Chuba Hubbard will be gone next season. That extension that he had late last year really is kind of a lot of funny money stuff that allows them to get out.
Yeah.
So in my mind, it's trading away Jonathan Taylor, the one known asset for, I don't know, a year plus of Devonta Adams, and maybe getting 2+ years out of Chuba Hubbard and Tony Pollard. Now, Jonathan Taylor might fall off too, right? I think he is eligible to be released from his contract in 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the Colts offense, even in a new regime, will probably still need years to build around, and we'll have to have Jonathan Taylor as part of that.
Yeah, I guess if your number one goal was adding depth, doing the 4 for 3 or 3 for 4 in this scenario, I guess you accomplished that. But I'm with you. I don't love bringing in an aging piece in Devonta Adams unless you're trying to go for it this year, which it doesn't sound like you are. If you're taking over an orphan team, DJ Moore is not young, not as young as I would have guessed. He's 28, but I still think DJ Moore versus Devonta Adams in terms of dynasty asset, like you might have given up the better player there. Chuba Hubbard, really like him for next year. Love what he did this past year. Not necessarily somebody I'm signing up to load up on in dynasty. I do like grabbing Jayden Reed. I don't necessarily love the path that you took to getting Jayden Reed, but I think if you could view that as somewhat of a buy low, buying in on a guy who's going into his 3rd season, that's fine with me. I don't know that you necessarily move the needle one way or the other on this trade.
Getting more bodies, and again, if we look at the depth, and maybe that's like, well, he had Keith Kirkwood like on his roster at that point. Like, fine, I get it. I would agree. I think the most Jake Tarski would always answer this, and he's my co-host on the Waiver Wire podcast. Who got the best player? That's the answer to who won the trade. And I don't always agree with him, but in this case, I think Jonathan Taylor is the best dynasty asset. And I recognize fully that maybe he's the Wisconsin sports alumni that might be factoring in on this a little bit. But I do think Jonathan Taylor is the best dynasty asset on that group.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. Good stuff as always, Joe. Appreciate all the work you put in on the Scott Fishbowl. Keep an eye out for that article. Once we get the formatting down, it's going to be easy. It'll be up on the site. You can check all that out. It'll look great. And keep an eye out for updates on that live event in Madison for the Scott Fishbowl. Joe and Jim Coventry going to be doing a live draft, a live podcast right after the draft. So if you're in that area, make sure you check it out. If not, make sure you catch that podcast live or wherever you get your podcasts. Want to thank Circa. We want to thank the NFFC, our 2 sponsors today. Joe, I will talk to you next week.
Sounds good.